Hello, and welcome back to Slow Night Ancient Tales. Tonight we journey deep into the rugged, beautiful mountains of Gangwon Province with a mystical Korean folk tale titled The Tale of Dupo. Originally penned by Kim Yu-jeong and completed by Han Deok, this story weaves a fascinating tapestry of an old, kind-hearted couple, a mysterious child with supernatural powers, and a greedy villager named Chilte. Lie back, close your eyes, and let this ancient legend of the General's Rock carry you away. Title: The Tale of Dupo. Source: Sonyeon 15, 1939. An Unexpected Foundling. This is a story that happened long ago in Gangwon Province. Gangwon Province is a mountainous region with many mountains and clean water. That is to say, rugged and formidable mountains stand shoulder to shoulder, and clear springs flow everywhere between them, making it a mountain village with very beautiful scenery. In a small village called Jangsagol, an old couple lived. They were honest in heart and never coveted others' belongings, and they were so kind-hearted that they had never even hit a dog, but for some reason they were always poor. Setting that aside, how wonderful would it have been if they had just one child between them? Truly, to them, not being able to have a child was a single great sorrow, even more so than being poor. Then one day the wife had a marvelous dream. It was a dream where a huge blue dragon was writhing and rising right next to the spot where she lay. It glared its eyes fiercely and pierced through the ceiling, and that sight was truly dreadful. It had almost completely slipped out, but it struggled because of the brightly burning brazier placed right beneath it. If only its tail could slip out, it would be done, but it could not because the fire was too hot. Finally, it let out a strange cry. Yong! And just as it struggled desperately once more with its tail, her mind suddenly went dizzy and she woke up just like that. There are all sorts of strange dreams. What was the blue dragon, and what was the meaning of that blazing brazier? Putting that aside, what could it mean that its tail alone caught and troubled it when the rest of its body had already escaped? The wife thought it was so bizarre that she told the story to her husband. Upon hearing this, even the husband widened his eyes. Then, after a while, he slapped his knee. Ah, what a pity. It's good, but he smacked his lips. He looked very disappointed. Isn't that exactly a conception dream? A conception dream? What do you mean? The wife asked back. I mean it's a dream of having a son. Having a son? What kind of son for those who are going to die the day after tomorrow? Sigh, that's what I mean. Why couldn't someone have dreamed it a bit earlier? The husband sighed with a sad face. Just then the sound of a small gong striking came from the twig gate. The wife came out carrying a small gourd of millet, also feeling a strange sensation. Until now, no monk had ever come to beg at this dilapidated, impoverished hovel. So what was going on today? It was quite an unusual event for a monk to be beating a gong in front of the collapsing twig gate. Pouring the millet into his knapsack, the wife said, "If I had white rice, I would bring it to you, but we only eat this millet." She felt quite apologetic. It was not right to treat a guest who had come from afar with mere millet. Even after giving the alms, she stood there blankly, her mind not quite at ease. So she gazed for a long time at the back of the monk as he turned and went down the path between the rice paddies and fields. Indeed, one sees all kinds of monks. Whether it's millet or rice, if someone gives alms, shouldn't there be a word of thanks? For a clean, old monk with completely white hair to silently take someone's offering, it must be said that it is a bit regrettable. But what was even stranger was that the very next day, at the exact same time, a monk came again. This time, when the wife came out with a small gourd of millet, wasn't it the very same old monk from yesterday? And just like yesterday, he silently accepted the alms and simply turned around to leave. How could a person be so blunt? Forget gratitude. Even a single soft word of greeting would be nice. However, the wife never frowned. Instead, she thought it was a joyful thing that he had come all this way to find them. Then on the third day, she couldn't help but be truly startled. At the exact same time, didn't that very monk come looking for them again? The wife poured the alms without a word and stared blankly at his face with bewildered eyes. Only then did the heavy mouth of the monk finally open. "Madam, I know a little about reading faces. Shall I read yours?" He looked blankly at the wife without thinking. The wife was so glad that she smiled broadly with her wrinkled face. Yes, please see when I might die. No, I am not going to tell you the date you will pass away, but I will tell you the good fortune that will come to you in the future. What fortune could possibly be left for a white-haired old woman who has almost lived out her life? Without trying to give any answer to this, the old monk plopped down on the straw mat right next to her. Then he rummaged through the pouch tied to his waist and pulled out strong reading glasses and a small book. Holding the book right under the glasses, he said, "Madam, you are truly a kind-hearted elder, but unfortunately, because of sins committed in your past life, you are suffering this hardship now." The monk stroked down his white beard with one hand and continued, "However, now you have paid off all those past sins through your suffering. From now on, fortune will return. First of all, you will have a baby." "No, how can an old woman like me have a baby?" She blinked her eyes as if it were preposterous, but still, something caught her interest. "Can the Samson, goddess of childbirth, grant a child even to old folks like us?" "It is not like that. You currently have a child, madam. It is just that the child is not visible to your eyes." "Yes, I have a child right now?" The wife could not help but roll her eyes wide in shock. She couldn't make head or tail of what the old monk was saying. "Then why can't I see it?" "Yes, you will see it gradually. I will show you now." Saying this, the old monk untied the knapsack he carried on his back. He placed it before his knees, rummaged through it, and pulled out a small bundle from the very place she had poured the millet. And when he untied that bundle again, how surprised the lady of the house must have been. It was the very bundle he carried around, gathering alms from house to house. Unexpectedly, a baby with clear eyes emerged from it. It was such a soft and tender, precious boy, perhaps 21 days old since birth. "Madam, this child is your very son." "Pardon?" The wife was dazed as if she had been struck, but seeing the baby, she was first of all delighted. Reaching out both hands and snatching it into her embrace, she said, "Are you really giving it to me?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "No, I am not giving him to you. He is your very son. But there might be a day later when I come back to find him." Leaving these few words behind, the old monk strode away around the mountain bend. Of course, no matter how much they tried to ask this and that, he never gave any answer. A happy home. The wife held the baby in her arms and hurriedly ran inside. "Dear husband." Panting, she calmed herself for a while and then explained the whole story in detail. And she clearly heard the old monk say, "He said this child is truly my son." "What? Our son?" The husband also widened his eyes, overjoyed, and ran outside the twig gate. No matter how he thought about it, this was no ordinary monk. He should meet him in person and politely offer words of gratitude. But even after searching the entire village thoroughly, there was no trace of the old monk. Trudging back home, he said, "Ah, don't touch him so much." And then he hugged the baby in his arms once more. He was indeed a cute and clean baby. How could his skin be so white and his eyes so clear? Perhaps this might be a dream. The husband rubbed his eyes with his hands and looked again, but it did not seem to be a dream. Then who was that old monk, and why did he leave this baby with them? No matter how much he pondered, the true intention was truly unknowable. But anyway, they were just happy to have gained a baby. They sat with the baby in the middle, unaware of the passing of the sun. The one they gained this way was Dupo. They made raising the baby their daily pastime. How nice would it have been if there were breast milk for the baby? Being already old, no matter how much the wife squeezed her breasts, nothing came out. Helplessly, whenever she fed him thin gruel made of boiled millet, she couldn't help but feel a deep pity. So from time to time the husband took the baby in his arms and went out into the village. It was because he went around to houses with babies, begging for a little bit of breast milk to feed him. Despite not having proper tools and having to beg for breast milk, the baby grew very well. Without ever becoming stunted, he grew rapidly and robustly like a sprouting blade of grass. And there are strange babies in the world, too. As he passed 10 years of age, his strength was more than a match for an adult. Not only that, his facial features were like a majestic, fierce tiger, making anyone who saw him bow their heads. Also, one could not help but be amazed by his filial piety toward his old parents. The village elders all liked the boy, and when they gathered among themselves, they would secretly whisper, "That Dupo is no ordinary child." The old father and mother loved him dearly, and they were carefully observing his daily changing behavior. Surely that child is no ordinary person. Others also seemed to think it strange. In this way, the old couple was looking at Dupo's future with great interest. Astounding wealth. Dupo grew rapidly and robustly. Of course, without ever suffering a single illness, he grew up tall and straight. The old father and mother were so happy they didn't know what to do. Seeing Dupo change day by day was truly their great happiness. If they sent their son out to the mountain in the morning, the two of them standing outside the twig gate in the evening, waiting for their son to return, was their daily routine. Not only that, as soon as Dupo came in, the household gradually began to prosper, didn't it? The little thatched hovel that used to sit at the foot of the mountain was gone somewhere. Now not even a shadow of it could be seen. And in its place, a huge tile-roofed house as big as a whale's back sat expansively. People all looked up to it, saying it wasn't just the best in the village, but probably the finest in the world. However, no one knew how they had become so rich. So some people thought it was because the people were inherently good, so God helped them. Some also thought it was because Dupo was very talented. Talented? What do you mean talented? It's just a damn thief's thievery. There were also those who wandered around spreading such baseless rumors behind their backs. Of course, this was Chilte, who lived across the way and hated Dupo like an enemy. Chilte was a strong man recognized in the village, a young man as fearsome as a fierce tiger. But his mind was inherently foul. He was a thief who would bring in other people's belongings and eat and live as if they were his own. Even though he committed such outrageous acts, no one in the village rebuked him. Why? Because he was so strong that if anyone foolishly challenged him, they might end up beaten to death by his hands. Thus, trusting in his own strength, Chilte once climbed over the back wall of Dupo's house. He coveted the rice, money, and various treasures in the back storehouse of this house. However, all he had to do was open it, go in, and sweep it all out. Believing no one would dare stop him, he confidently twisted the lock on the storehouse door. At this moment, what on earth happened? "You scoundrel!" With a terrifying sound like a thunderbolt, it felt as if an iron mace had fallen on his back, bringing immense pain. Just as his mind reeled and he was about to collapse forward, wouldn't his heavy body be hoisted up into the air? But when he fell back down, he had almost completely lost his senses. However, how could a strong man who prided himself on his strength fail to muster any energy over such a little thing? Straining hard, he opened his eyes, and what a bizarre thing it was. Chilte's heavy body was held in Dupo's two arms like a little child. And how had the event that started inside the house ended up out here, outside the main gate? This was truly the unknowable work of a ghost. Then, Dupo lifted Chilte's body high and threw him into the grass like a piece of old rag. Then, wiping his two hands on his trouser legs, he said, "You scoundrel, try that again. Next time I will break your back." And he went back into the house. His attitude seemed to say that even if 105 guys like Chilte came at once, it would be laughable. Quietly watching this, Chilte could not help but be dumbfounded. He had strutted around thinking he was a strong man, but was it right to suffer such humiliation from a kid who was barely 15? Setting that aside, how on earth did he fly through the air and come out outside the main gate? No matter how much he thought about it, he could not help but be amazed by Dupo's skill. In front of the storehouse door, it was certain that Dupo had effortlessly lifted Chilte's body and hurled him into the air. And before that body could fall into the furrow outside the gate, he must have dashed out swiftly and caught him with both hands. If he hadn't done that, Chilte would have hit the ground and been flattened like a pancake. This did not seem like the deed of a human being at all. Chilte felt a chill run down his spine as if possessed by a goblin, and he harbored a very terrifying resolve in his heart. "Humph. So you can't be beaten by strength alone. Let's see about that." Thinking this, Chilte carried his axe on his waist and roamed the mountains every day. Why? Because when Dupo went up to the mountain in the morning, nobody saw a shadow of him all day long. They only saw his back as he returned home in the evening. Then where does Dupo spend his days? This was the suspicious point for all the village people. However, Chilte naturally thought like this. What could that bastard possibly be doing? There must be a thieves' den deep in the mountain, and he goes there to spend his days. So if I wander the mountains, I will meet you someday. He was determined that once they met, he would immediately attack and split his skull in two. For half a month, Chilte scoured the mountains, braving day and night. He thoroughly searched every mountain there was, but what was this? Dupo's footsteps were nowhere to be found. Chilte's revenge. Then one day, it was dusk as the sun was setting over the western mountains. After wandering the mountains all day long, Chilte was coming down lackadaisically when a person's shadow flickered in the valley opposite him. Unconsciously, he drew his body back and stared carefully. Then he was so overjoyed that his body trembled. Dupo, whom he had searched for so frantically, rolling his eyes all this time. Humph, it is you, Dupo. Now take a taste of my axe, you scoundrel. Chilte hid himself in the forest and tailed Dupo. But as he got closer to Dupo, he could not help but open his eyes wide. Why? Because on Dupo's two shoulders there rested two huge tigers. Seeing this, it was obvious that Dupo had beaten them to death with his bare fists and was bringing them down. Chilte's following legs halted, and he stood still like a wooden totem pole. No matter how much he carried an axe, if he carelessly attacked Dupo, he didn't know what would happen to his own life. While hesitating whether to do this or that, it happened that Dupo sat on a rock and fixed the ties of his straw shoes. Seeing his bent-over back, Chilte mustered his courage again. This little bastard, if I just sneak up from behind and strike down with my axe, it's over. Making up his mind like this, he lay flat on the mountain ridge and crawled up silently. Even when Chilte's head carefully rose from behind, Dupo did not know. He just bent his back and earnestly fixed his shoe ties. Chilte straightened his back and pulled out the axe from his waist. Then, deciding this was the moment, he put all his body's strength into it and struck down on the nape of Dupo's neck. Because it was an axe blow struck with such great effort, Chilte himself did not know what happened. He clearly saw with his own eyes Dupo's body split in two on the blade of the axe, but looking again, Dupo's body was nowhere to be seen. There was only the clack sound of the axe blade hitting the rock, followed by a flash of fire, and that was it. And from the flying sparks, one of Chilte's left eyes immediately went blind. It was a truly bizarre thing. How could a person's body turn into a rock? Chilte was fiercely angry at being deceived by Dupo. But since there was nothing he could do, he rubbed his aching eye with the back of his hand and trudged down the mountain. And thinking carefully, he now realized that Dupo was no ordinary person. Just looking at Dupo's old parents, one could tell. They were people who had already passed the time to die. Yet, after taking the medicinal herbs Dupo occasionally brought from the mountain, weren't they always staying fresh and vigorous? Besides this, even among the village people, there wasn't just one or two people who were gasping on the verge of death, but survived after taking those herbs from Dupo. Just from seeing this, one could tell Dupo possessed an extraordinary magic trick. Here, Chilte thought again. No matter how much he chased around trying to kill Dupo, in the end, it would only be to his own detriment. This time, he would have to use a different, clever scheme. Chilte came down to the village and committed robberies many times larger than before. And he went around behind people's backs, saying, "I wondered who that Dupo fellow was, but it turns out he's a convict from a large gang of thieves." He made up all sorts of lies. At first, the village people were half in doubt and let it go in one ear and out the other. But as the saying goes, there is no tree that won't fall after 10 strokes, and eventually, they ended up listening with keen interest. And here and there in the village, they say that Dupo is a great thief. That must be it. Otherwise, where would that huge tile-roofed house come from? And when he goes out in the morning, you can't even see his shadow, right? Yeah, Dupo is definitely a thief. You can tell just by seeing that the village gets robbed every single day lately. And so, vicious slander against Dupo poured out incessantly. Thus, all the people gathered and held a meeting, and they decided to either drive Dupo's family out of the village or kill them off. First, they ordered Dupo to leave the village far away. At that time, Dupo's reply was, "Where is the law that drives out an innocent person?" He just smiled gently, and even after a few days passed, he did not leave. The village people discussed that since they had no other choice now, they should catch Dupo and kill him first. So early one morning, about 30 strong men gathered and flocked to Dupo's house, trying to catch Dupo. It was an early morning before the sun had even fully spread its light. The village people crowded into the gateway of Dupo's house. Some of the strongest among them carried thick ropes, and some even carried hexagonal wooden clubs. If Dupo allowed himself to be caught obediently, fine, but if he resisted, they planned to beat him to death without hesitation. First, they stood outside the main gate and shouted loudly, "Dupo, come out. You must quietly let yourself be tied, otherwise harm will come to your parents as well." Dupo came out rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. But, not knowing what was going on, he looked at them in bewildered. At that moment, the 30 village people rushed in all at once and captured Dupo. Some twisted his arms behind his back, and others tangled his neck with ropes. While they tied him up like this, Dupo showed no sign of surprise. He just let them tie him as they pleased and merely stared at them. They were excited to have caught Dupo so easily, unexpectedly. Now, all they had to do was drag him deep into the mountains and kill him. No matter if he had the skills of General Zhang Fei, he wouldn't be able to escape this situation. They roughly dragged Dupo away, much like dragging a dog. At this moment, Dupo, who had been standing silently, put strength into his 2 shoulders, and the thick ropes that had tightly bound his body in several layers snapped with a tuk-tuk sound. It looked as effortless as snapping some flimsy thread scraps. Seeing this, the village people opened their eyes wide. Some were so shocked that sweat even broke out on their foreheads. Was this guy a human or a ghost? No matter how you looked at him, he had a mouth, a nose, and 2 eyes just like anyone else. But what on earth was this guy? While they stood there absent-mindedly like this, Dupo spread his arms wide and drove them away. As a result, some fell backward, some tumbled forward, and some ran away. The sight was quite a spectacle. Thus, they went to Dupo and only suffered humiliation. Thinking about it again, this was a disgrace to the village. The adults of the village had been humiliated by a mere 15-year-old kid. Could this be tolerated? They gathered again to devise a new plan. This new plan was based on the fact that Dupo could never be caught. So this time, the plot was to set fire to the house and burn all 3 family members to death. One day, late at night, they each set out carrying a load of wood on an A-frame carrier. This wood was to surround Dupo's house and be set on fire. Then this fire would gradually spread to Dupo's house, and ultimately it would burn Dupo and the 3 family members without a trace. So, without making a sound, they kept piling up the wood. After doing this for a while, thinking, now, even if you want to escape, you will have no way to get out, they set the fire all at once from all directions. Because the wood was so dry, it blazed up fiercely the moment the fire touched it. Later, the flames soared to the sky, and it seemed as if the entire village had turned into a sea of fire. They stood at a distance, watching the fire spread toward Dupo's house. Now, they must have all burned to death without fail. Right, no matter how sharp his skills are, he couldn't possibly survive in this fire. Exactly. He was only strong. What kind of magic could he have? They exchanged mocking words with each other like this. Meanwhile, the flames increasingly slanted down and ate their way toward the house. In about the time it takes to eat a meal, the flames would completely lick the eaves of the house. They stood watching with a delightful sense of amusement. However, just as the flames were about to lick the eaves of Dupo's house, what kind of trick was this? Under a bright moonlit sky, a sudden gust of wind rose, and bean-sized raindrops poured down in torrents. Not long after that, the fire that had almost completely burned into Dupo's house gradually began to extinguish. They were so shocked that they became like mute people who had eaten honey. They only exchanged glances with each other, and not a single person opened their mouth. They say there are thunderbolts from a clear blue sky. Isn't this exactly that? They secretly swallowed their fear and stood shivering. This must surely be a person sent by heaven, not an ordinary person. Yes, this is definitely the magic of heaven. How could it be done by human strength? They whispered among themselves, and a discussion broke out. They were burning with anxiety, wondering if they might now receive punishment. Since they had to ride to kill the kind and pure Dupo, how could they not receive punishment for it? See that? Try to kill an innocent person, and wouldn't a sudden thunderbolt fall from a clear sky? As one person frowned, Chilte, who was standing right next to him, jumped up in anger. What divine punishment? Is it divine punishment to catch a thief? He got angry for no reason. However, no matter how angry Chilte got, there was no other way now. The village people disappeared one by one, slowly, and the rain poured down heavily. The strange old monk Chilte was so angry that he lost one of his eyes because of Dupo, and the more he thought about it, the angrier he got. Even if his body were torn to shreds, how could he not avenge this enemy? If only he had his way, he wanted to attack immediately and bite off Dupo's head. Chilte tailed Dupo every single day. His plan was to harm him whenever a good opportunity arose. However, for some reason, he kept losing Dupo midway. Sometimes he missed him because he couldn't keep up with Dupo's pace, and other times, even with his eyes wide open, he would mindlessly lose sight of where Dupo went right in front of him. In this way, Chilte wasted nearly a month in vain. Then one day, strangely enough, he met Dupo in the mountains. On this day, he didn't particularly have the intention of finding Dupo. He just went deep into the mountains, carrying his A-frame carrier with the thought of gathering wood. But his body was exhausted, and while he was squatting on a tree root dozing off, it happened. About 20 can away from where Chilte was sitting, a huge rock lay. It was a rugged, house-sized rock, and right in the middle of it, a pine tree was wedged. But as he looked vaguely in his half-asleep state, wasn't that rock moving and twitching? What is this? Such a huge rock couldn't possibly move, could it? Chilte rubbed his sleepy eyes with his hand and looked clearly once more. No matter how many times he looked again, the rock was definitely moving. Only then did Chilte realize it was no ordinary matter and hid his body in the forest. And keeping his eyes wide open, he glared at the rock. A little while later, the middle of that house-sized rock split wide open, and at the same time, a general riding a pure white dragon horse emerged. The general looked around in all directions, and then disappeared into the sky like a shooting arrow. At this time, what surprised Chilte were the wings attached to the general's armpits. Spreading the dazzlingly flashing wings wide, the general flew away with the dragon horse. And what was even more surprising was that the general's face looked exactly like Dupo's face, to an uncanny degree. Could this really be Dupo, or did I see incorrectly in my sleep? He doubted many things. But if he just watched a little longer, he would know everything. Even if he spent the whole day here, he was determined to find out for sure, so he kept his eyes peeled and sat on guard. Sitting there from broad daylight, Chilte didn't even realize the sun was setting over the western mountains. When the general and the dragon horse appeared again, Chilte absent-mindedly studied his facial features. But no matter how much he studied it, it was undeniably Dupo's face. The general, still riding the dragon horse, entered the rock he had emerged from earlier. Then the rock that had split wide open closed up again, returning exactly to how it was placed before. And a little while later, from the other side of that rock, the real Dupo walked out. And behind him, an old man walked out, dragging a walking stick. His appearance was exactly the appearance of the old monk who had pulled Dupo out of his knapsack 15 years ago. The old man led Dupo down to the sandy field below, and the two stood there, starting a conversation. The old man drew on the ground with his stick to teach him something, stroked Dupo's head with his hand, and muttered something. Every time, Dupo gathered his hands politely in front of him and listened respectfully. Chilte tried hard to eavesdrop on their conversation, but the distance was too far, so he couldn't properly hear a single word. Who was that old man, and why did he love Dupo so much? No matter how much he pondered, it was an unknowable thing. Then, as Dupo bowed low in front of the old man vanished right from that spot. Only then did Dupo begin to come down towards the foot of the mountain. Chilte followed Dupo from a distance, pondering this and that. Should I chase him and strike him with the axe again? But what if, like last time, I get hit and go completely blind? Still, as a man, is it right to be afraid of that? Chilte pulled out his axe again and followed stealthily. He planned to follow him to a secluded place and strike him dead without a trace. The distance between Dupo and Chilte gradually closed. Eventually, Chilte was right on his heels, only about 4 or 5 steps away. At this distance, even if he raised his axe to strike, there would be no failure. Just as Dupo turned around a thick pine tree, the moment Chilte flashed his axe high, "You scoundrel, take my axe," and with all his might he struck down towards his head. At the same time, with a cry of "I go," Chilte fell backward onto the ground. Because when he struck down the axe, Dupo had instantly disappeared. And the axe had swung down powerfully through the empty air and struck Chilte's own shin with a thwack. Dark red blood gushed out of his leg like a spring. Thus, Chilte hugged that leg with both hands and, "Save me," he screamed so loudly that the mountains echoed. But because it was such a deep mountain, no one came to his aid. After Kim Yu-jeong's death, Chapter 7 and onwards were completed by Yu-jeong, the strange walking stick. No matter how much he shouted for someone to save him, that sound only echoed back and forth between this valley and that mountain peak. No one came out to answer. Chilte was really in big trouble. The sun had set and it was getting darker, and from the wound struck by the axe, blood flowed endlessly. It hurt so much that tears poured down naturally. However, rather than the pain, Chilte cried because he feared that he might die without even getting his revenge on this enemy Dupo. But was that all? It was already pitch dark everywhere, and the rough wind went swaa through the dense trees, and occasionally the terrifying roar of a wild beast echoing ahung through the mountain could be heard. It seemed to be a tiger. That sound was getting closer and closer to where Chilte was. It was indeed a tiger. An enormously large tiger, its eyes flashing between the pine trees, was approaching, aiming at Chilte. Unable to move, it seemed Chilte was going to become tiger food in this deep mountain without anyone knowing. As for moving his steps, Chilte couldn't move a single foot or lift a single arm. No matter how great his strength was, in this condition, how could he possibly fend off a fierce beast like a tiger? Still, the only thing Chilte could do was call for a person and beg for rescue. "Save me! Save me!" And is nobody there? Then, from somewhere, Chilte. A voice calling him was heard. It was Dupo's voice. But there were many strange things. Only the calling voice could be heard. Neither Dupo nor anyone else could be seen. Looking around in all directions, what kind of weird incident was this for Chilte's eyes? In the spot where the tiger was just a moment ago, the tiger was nowhere to be found, and unexpectedly, a white-haired old monk stood, leaning his body on a long walking stick. Chilte bowed countless times to that old monk and begged with these words, "I came to the mountain to gather wood, but I met a wicked thief and ended up in this state. Please just help me get to the village down below." However, the old monk just stood there listening silently. Then suddenly he opened his mouth. "If you try to harm an innocent person, can you realize that you yourself will end up being harmed instead?" The old monk looked down at Chilte with a stern face. But Chilte, not even understanding the meaning of those words, just said, "Of course I know. How could I not know? If so, can you change your mind and behave kindly from now on?" "Yes, of course I will change. I will change it 100 times over." Chilte prostrated himself and swore, but in his heart, he only thought of how to escape this situation. The old monk spoke once more. "If you commit wicked deeds again, can you keep in mind that great harm will befall your body? After receiving a firm oath from Chilte, hold on to this and follow me." The old monk lifted his walking stick and handed it to Chilte. What a truly strange walking stick it was. As soon as Chilte grasped the end of that stick, his leg, which had been hurting until now, was instantly cured as if washed clean, and his body felt so light he thought he could fly through the air. Perhaps it was also because of this stick for the old monk. His back was bent, but his pace could not be called that of an old man. His speed was faster than a young person's. Jumping over rocks and leaping across streams like that, Chilte, led by the old monk, went down the rugged mountain path as if he had never injured his leg at all. Before long, reaching the entrance of the village where Chilte lived, the old monk stopped his steps. Then he said once more, Keep in mind that if you try to harm an innocent person, harm will return to your own body first." As soon as he left these words, the old monk vanished like smoke right before Chilte's eyes. He had never seen such a strange old man in the world. Chilte, feeling it wasn't a human affair, rubbed his eyes and looked around, wondering if this was really the entrance to his village or not. It was unmistakably the village entrance, in front of the stone bridge. But what was the reason for this? Just as he turned and tried to move his steps, suddenly one of his feet hurt so much he couldn't lift it. The leg that had been perfectly fine just a moment ago suddenly started bleeding profusely, just like in the mountain earlier. Chilte simply collapsed onto the ground. And "Save me, save me." He shouted loudly toward the village. Wondering what had happened, the village people gathered from this house and that house, surrounded Chilte in the middle and said, "What happened? What happened?" Everyone's eyes went round with curiosity. Then Chilte said, "That thief Dupo? He made up a story that while he was hunting a roe deer in the mountain, that bastard Dupo was hiding and suddenly struck him with a stone, crippling his leg like this, and then stole the roe deer he had caught." And as if it were really true, Chilte ground his teeth fiercely. The village people all pitied Chilte, clicked their tongues, and called Dupo a wicked scoundrel, and they carried Chilte on their backs to his house. An outrageous framing. A bizarre thing occurred in the village. At night, fires of unknown origin broke out in this house and that house in the village. It wasn't just for a day or two. Every day, as soon as night fell, the cry of "Fire! Fire!" rang out as if scheduled, and one or two houses would naturally burn to ashes. If this continued, it seemed not a single intact house would remain in the village. The village people, not knowing the reason for the nightly fires, widened their eyes at each other in worry, and there was no one who knew the proper way to handle it. One person would say, "Clearly this is a mountain fire, it's a mountain fire," and claim it was because they hadn't sincerely offered rituals to the mountain, urging them to immediately hold a mountain ritual right now. Then another person would say, "What do you mean mountain fire? It's the goblins doing. Goblins doing." Speaking as if he had seen the goblins' NK with his own eyes, he insisted the only solution was to make steamed rice cakes and pray, or otherwise call a blind exorcist to recite scriptures and drive the goblins away. While everyone was arguing that their own words were right, Chilte stepped forward boldly, and he said, "What do you mean mountain fire, and what do you mean goblins doing?" He made a face that suggested he knew everything. "Then if it's not a mountain fire, what is it? Then if it's not the goblins doing, what is it?" The people grew anxious and stepped closer to Chilte, asking, "So you guys only think of mountain fires and goblins, and can't even think of that bastard Dupo?" Chilte suddenly flew into a rage, acting as if it were frustrating that they didn't know this and only talked nonsense. And he claimed that Dupo was coming out to the village every night to set fires as revenge for them trying to set fire to his house. "Look at the evidence," he said. "Wasn't it true that fires only broke out in the houses of the people who had gone to set fire to Dupo's house the other day? Indeed, thinking about it that way, the houses of the people who had gone to set fire to Dupo's house had all suffered damage without exception. The village people said, 'Ah, look at that scoundrel who deserves to die.' They clenched their fists and felt resentful, as if it had been completely proven to be Dupo's doing. But in reality, it was Chilte's doing. At night, Chilte would come out limping and set fire under the eaves. He should have been afraid of the warning words of the old monk with the strange stick. But since Chilte was inherently wicked, he wasn't the type to take such words to heart. His mind was only filled with the thought of how to take revenge on this enemy Dupo, who had blinded his eye and crippled his leg. However, since he absolutely could not match Dupo in strength or skill, he went around behind his back, setting fires like this, and pinning the blame on Dupo. His thought was that if he did this, the village people wouldn't leave Dupo alone, so Chilte would get his revenge even if he stayed still. Not knowing his inner thoughts, the village people were ready to kill Dupo. "What should we do with that bastard?" This was their common talk whenever they gathered. However, not a single person suggested a way to do anything. They were secretly terrified that if they acted rashly against Dupo's immense strength and magic, they would instead suffer a great disaster. So, even in times like this, they had no choice but to say, "What should we do?" and borrow Chilte's wisdom. As if he had been waiting for it, Chilte gathered the people in one place and whispered some scheme. Then the people smiled confidently and each returned to their homes, bringing out tools like pickaxes, shovels, and wooden rakes. As the day darkened, those people gathered at the large stream that flowed next to the village and silently began to block the middle of the stream. They tore up turf to cover it, brought rocks to press it down, dug up dirt to spread it. As they did so, the stream water gradually began to pool. By the time dawn broke, the water of that large stream had overflowed like a lake. Now the work was all done. They broke open the middle of the embankment, facing the foot of the mountain where Dupo's house was. The water rushed like a waterfall with a terrifying momentum toward Dupo's house. The village people stood on the hill and looked at that magnificent sight with very delighted faces. Now, in the blink of an eye, the water would wipe out Dupo's house in one swoop. No matter how outstanding Dupo's skills were, he would be completely helpless this time. But what was this? As the tip of the water reached the vicinity of Dupo's house, the water subsided as if a huge sinkhole had opened up there. Finally, the water subsided so much that the bottom of the stream was exposed. It was so absurd that the village people stared at each other's faces before quietly returning one by one, leaving only Chilte standing on the hill, unable to close his gaping mouth. However, Chilte was not one to give up with just this. At night, Chilte went around the village even more severely, stealing and setting fires. Becoming increasingly reckless, he even went to neighboring villages or distant villages, continuing such acts. The more he did this, the more people resented Dupo, and the desire to get rid of him grew. Eventually, even the government office became very concerned about the matter and distributed notices to every village, stating that they would give a great reward to anyone who caught Dupo. Chilte's end. Whenever even two village people gathered, they whispered stories about Dupo. In front of the village entrance notice board, which posted the advertisement that a generous reward would be given to anyone who caught Dupo, people gathered constantly for days on end, reading the notice and listening to others read it out loud. Even so, not a single person even dared to think about catching Dupo. With what strength would they dare to suppress Dupo's astonishing magic and energy? Dupo is a person sent by heaven. How could people like us dare to catch him? That's right, exactly. Look at him performing magic. Is that the deed of a human? It's the magic of gods. Everyone shook their heads. However, Chilte was still talking big. Magic? What kind of magic could a guy like him possibly perform? It all just happened by chance. And with a sudden, displeased voice, Chilte looked left and right. So, are you all just going to stand by and watch even if the whole village and the whole county turn into ashes because of that bastard Dupo? He relentlessly egged the village people on. At this time, another event occurred that stimulated the village people's greed to catch Dupo. At that time, for some reason, officials from the royal court personally rode in carriages, touring the 8 provinces to find a certain person. That carriage also appeared in a town not far from this village and spread this rumor. Anyone who guided them to a person looking such and such would not only be treated with abundant wealth, but also be granted a high government post. But the strange thing was that the appearance of the person they were looking for exactly matched the appearance of Dupo. The age was the same at 15. The facial features were like that. And what's more, even having a black mole on the forehead was the same. How could it be so identical, as if they were talking with Dupo right in front of them? It was Dupo, without a doubt. What kind of background did Dupo have that the royal court would search for a mere boy, even offering a large reward? Putting that aside, well, if they just caught Dupo, not only would they get the reward given by the government office, but they would also obtain a government post from the country. So how great was that? Even a poor person without status could instantly change their destiny. Blinded by this, there were also people who talked big. No matter how skilled that Dupo bastard is at magic, he's still a 15-year-old kid. Are you saying you can't take down one kid? rolling up their sleeves. These were the hot-blooded youths in the village. And the older people said, "To catch a guy who uses magic, you must also use magic to catch him," making a face as if they knew that magic. But no one actually stepped forward with confidence. Above all, they were afraid that if they acted rashly, they might instead suffer a great disaster. They all racked their brains to the point of turning dark, wondering if there was some clever trick to ensnare him flawlessly without causing any such mishap. Among them, Chilte was pondering even more. For him, this was an opportunity he would not get twice. If he caught Dupo this time, not only would he avenge the enemy who crippled his eye and leg, but he would also gain both wealth and fame. Just there, thinking about it made his greed stir. How can I bind that bastard Dupo with my own hands? However, with Chilte's own skills, he absolutely could not match Dupo's magic and strength. It really wasn't a human affair. How could human power suddenly make rain fall from a clear sky and make all that water seep under the ground in an instant? This was not human strength. There must be some secret that gave Dupo that superhuman power. Reaching this thought, Chilte suddenly said, "Right, that's it." He slapped his knee and stood up. From that day on, Chilte tailed Dupo and observed his movements. What Dupo did every day was leave the house and go to the mountain when the day dawned. Chilte covered his body with grass for clothing and stealthily followed him. He intended to uncover the unknown secret Dupo held. But it was strange. No matter how brightly he kept his eyes open and tailed him, he kept losing Dupo midway. And the place he always lost him was near the rock where the old pine tree stood. It was as if, upon reaching the vicinity of that rock, Dupo's form smoothly vanished like smoke. In fact, that was true. Upon reaching the vicinity of the rock, Dupo would change his body so that it could not be seen by anyone's eyes. From then on, Chilte hid his body in the nearby grass and guarded that rock. Then, the exact same phenomenon Chilte had seen previously occurred. When Dupo arrived in front of that rock and chanted a single word of a true mantra, the house-sized rock twitched and then split wide open in the middle. Then Dupo went in, and the rock closed up as before, and when it opened again a while later, a general riding a pure white dragon horse appeared, flapping his dazzling white wings and disappearing into the sky. It was astonishing. The general riding that dragon horse was none other than Dupo. The magic must somehow lie in this rock. Even without this, it was a rock with miraculous efficacy. Sick people who prayed there would be cured, and childless people who prayed for a child would conceive. That must be it. How could a person with the same eyes, nose, and mouth perform such magic otherwise? Now, as if he had realized Dupo's secret, Chilte nodded his head and went down the mountain with a face full of joy. Perhaps Chilte had some terrible plot. He went straight down the mountain to his house, peeked into the kitchen and the storehouse, and brought out an iron hammer, a chisel, lumps of lead, a pot, and charcoal. He put them in a mesh bag, carried it on his back, and left the house, still with a face full of joy. And checking to see that Dupo had returned to his house, he immediately rushed up the mountain. Finally reaching the place where the rock was, Chilte put down the mesh bag and took out the hammer and chisel. Then he paused, looked around in all directions as if being cautious about something, hesitated, and soon placed the chisel in the middle of the rock and began to strike it with the hammer. Even so, he must have been very scared. Chilte continuously looked around in all directions as he worked. There was no one. Only the sound of the hammer hitting the chisel rang clearly through the mountain valley. Still, Chilte was someone known as a strong man in the village. Furthermore, the hammer striking down with gathered strength drove the chisel root 1 or 2 inches into the rock in no time. The chisel went deeper and deeper, 3 inches, 4 inches, 1 foot, and then 2 feet deep. And on one side he lit a red-hot charcoal fire and melted the lumps of lead. Finally, when a hole 3 or 4 feet deep was pierced in the rock, Chilte gave a very satisfied laugh. And, "You bastard, now let's see." With a joyful face as if he had already caught Dupo, he poured the bubbling, boiling lead straight into that hole. However, Chilte's face instantly turned pale blue. As soon as he poured the boiling lead into the hole pierced in the rock, suddenly, with a tremendous sound like heaven and earth collapsing, the ground shook along with the rock. But was that all? The mountain opposite him rushed forward toward Chilte and collapsed over him. Only then did Chilte realize he had incurred divine punishment. "Ah, God, please forgive my sins." He begged, but his body was already buried under the pouring stones. The history of Dupo. No matter how much the village people racked their brains to catch Dupo, there was no way. They all had frustrated faces, and when they met, they asked each other, "Do you have any good ideas on what to do?" However, no one had a brilliant answer. Then one fellow slapped his knee and said, "Right, this would be good." He gathered many people in one place, and, "There's no other way. Let's capture Dupo's old parents and lock them up. Then, since that Dupo bastard has utmost filial piety toward his parents, even if we don't struggle to catch him, he will crawl in and kneel on his own." That made sense. Since Dupo was extremely filial to his parents to begin with, if he found out that his elderly father and mother were imprisoned and suffering because of him, it was a given that he would not stay still. The village people all agreed that this was a good idea, and with the thought of getting the job done right away, they competed to be first as they rushed toward Dupo's house. However, upon reaching the vicinity of Dupo's house, the people who had been walking ahead confidently suddenly stopped their steps. It was because they worried that Dupo might know beforehand and interfere. But they did not hesitate for long over that matter. As if simply inviting them to someone's birthday feast, if they gently called out the old couple, they were such inherently kind-hearted elders that there was no way they wouldn't comply. The village people became even more excited and swaggered toward Dupo's house. Finally, they reached the front gate of Dupo's house. But in the outer courtyard of that house, a boy was kicking a shuttlecock. Because his appearance was so much like Dupo's, the village people halted in surprise. However, even if his facial features were the same as Dupo's, his expression and actions were not Dupo's. Stopping kicking the shuttlecock, the eyes that looked around at the faces of the village people gathering around him were the frightened look of an ordinary 15-or-so-year-old boy. The brave and magnanimous spirit seen in the past was nowhere to be found, and he only looked like a gentle and cautious young master of a study room, raised preciously. How could anyone call this boy the Dupo who used to perform such astonishing feats of strength and magic? The village people found it so strange that they looked him up and down for a while, and then asked like this, "Whose house do you belong to, playing here?" "I am a boy who lives in this house." "Then what is your name?" "My name is Dupo." "What, Dupo?" The village people stepped back in shock. Rather than the name Dupo itself, they were even more shocked, wondering how Dupo could have changed like this. If it was no one else but this boy who was exactly Dupo, what need was there to take his old parents and lock them up, and what was there to fear? It seemed he would obediently follow even if they just took him by the wrist and led him away. It even made them wonder what kind of sin this kind and weak-looking boy could have possibly committed. Furthermore, considering their dignity as adults, they felt awkward about laying hands on this young boy first, so the village people just stood there blankly looking at each other's faces. Then, one fellow among them, greedy to catch Dupo and claim the reward, stepped forward and strictly threatened him like this. "You are the very Dupo, you say?" "Yes, I am indeed Dupo." "Then, you scoundrel, do you not know your sins?" "What sins are you saying I committed? You don't know your sins? If you don't know, I'll teach you, so take this." Saying this, the man pulled out a thick rope and lunged forward to tie him up. At this moment, from the main road opposite, a carriage leading many foot soldiers was heading this way. It was clearly the party from the royal court that had come down and was staying in the town. They must be coming to catch Dupo. The village people left Dupo and split wide open to both sides. When the carriage reached the entrance of the house, it stopped, and a person in a luxurious official uniform got out and came to where Dupo was. Then he bowed respectfully in the manner a subject would to a king, and he supported the bewildered Dupo, encouraging him to board the empty carriage that was right behind. Far from dealing with him as a criminal, they treated him like a king or someone of that stature. The village people were so surprised by this completely unexpected event that they couldn't close their gaping mouths. But what was even more surprising was the old couple of that house. Not knowing what was going on, thinking only that they were losing the Dupo they had considered and lived with as their real son until now, they wore crying faces, clung to the official's collar, and begged him to leave Dupo right by their side. Then, an old monk leaning on a long walking stick, the very old monk who had visited the old couple 15 years ago and left Dupo with them, appeared from out of nowhere and warmly greeted them. It is solely due to your merit that the helpless newborn baby has grown this much today. The old monk offered his words of gratitude and then said, "The baby I left with you 15 years ago is none other than the crown prince of this country. Only now have the rebellious subjects been defeated and the country set right, allowing him to ascend to the throne again. So you should be joyful, please do not be sad at all." Thus, he comforted the old couple who were sad to be separated from Dupo. That was true. 15 years ago from now, a subject whom the king of the country trusted and loved harbored dark intentions, started a rebellion, and invaded all the way to the royal palace. In the midst of such danger, the current old monk, who held the rank of prime minister at the time, embraced the young crown prince, barely escaped the rebellion, disguised himself as an old monk, and roamed the 8 provinces looking for someone suitable to raise the crown prince. Then he found the old couple living extremely poor but kindly in a mountain village in Gangwon province, considered them very trustworthy, and entrusted the baby to them. And he himself stayed in a nearby mountain, waiting for the rebellion to subside, while at the same time teaching the crown prince everything suitable for him to become a wise monarch in the future. Now the rebellious subjects had been defeated, and the country set right, and the crown prince was finally able to ascend to the throne as king. However, the old monk wore a very sad face. That was because if he had practiced the way for just about 1 more month, he would have made the crown prince the most supreme monarch under heaven. But alas, because of Chiltae, the 10 years of effort had turned into nothing. How could he not be sad? If only Chiltae had not poured boiling lead into that rock, Dupo would have been a general with wings sprouting from his shoulders, capable of performing all sorts of Taoist magic. There is no need to speak at length about how the future of a country ruled by such a king would have been. But it is fine. As a replacement for losing such astonishing strength and magic, the crown prince was able to possess an endlessly kind heart and virtuous character, which is enough to make him a sage king. However, what was truly apologetic were the village people. Not knowing all this and falling for Chiltae's deceit, they had presumptuously tried to harm the crown prince. How grave was their sin! Saying that dying 100 times would not be enough, they all prostrated themselves, crying and begging. But the generous crown prince, far from taking offense, forgave everything and exempted that village from paying taxes to the country for 10 years before his carriage departed. After that, the old couple kept the house and property the crown prince left behind, enjoying wealth and longevity for a long time. Even now in Gangwon province, that rock remains exactly as it was, and it is called the General Rock. That concludes the Tale of Dupo for tonight. I hope the magical transformations and the deep lessons hidden within this mountainous legend leave a touch of wonder in your dreams. Remember, you can always take our stories with you on Spotify whenever you need a moment of rest. Wishing you a peaceful and restorative sleep. This is Kyle, signing off. Good night.